After uploading my Homefront review last summer, I realized that I didn't thoroughly explain why I enjoy the game's final level. I gave a general overview of the stage being a sort of summarized vision of what the team wanted, a greatest hits of the many mechanics and features, but in retrospect my argument wasn't really convincing. So I turned to Transformers Fall of Cybertron. Like Homefront, its final level takes a variety of standout mechanics and moments from the campaign and mashes them together into a climactic conclusion. It perfectly illustrates and surpasses what I enjoyed in Homefront's final level. But after replaying the game, I felt the limitation of scope just didn't do it justice. Cause guys and gals, Transformers Fall of Cybertron is really fun. It's certainly no pioneer of the wild and uncharted game design frontier, but it is built with such a competence that to focus exclusively on the final level feels like a dismissal of the effort put into everything beforehand. Judging by the cover, it's just another one of Activision's throwaway annual releases, but once you get past the gratuitous tutorial section, you find yourself in a finely tuned, well-paced, dynamic roller coaster of gaming fun. When I started this channel, I wanted to try and critique games that other channels weren't or wouldn't. At the very least, I could bring in a fresh new perspective on some of the more commonly discussed games. While the YouTube game critics scene has expanded faster than my ability to keep up, I still think there is value in these goals. Because Transformers Fall of Cybertron doesn't challenge common conventions and has no lofty goals of innovation, it stands the risk of being overlooked and forgotten in the churning mill of new releases. It's okay not to be innovative or revolutionary. Sometimes it's fine to simply make a good game. In this episode of RamblePak64, I'm going to explain why and how Transformers Fall of Cybertron's competence shouldn't easily be dismissed. Look out and shout, cause we're rolling out. The first thing to keep in mind is that this is an Activision published title. That does not mean it's a bad game. It just means there's a good chance High Moon Studios had a checklist of gameplay elements or tropes they needed to hit in order to get the publisher's approval. Just as THQ and Chaos Studios are trying to imitate and surpass the influence of Call of Duty Modern Warfare with Homefront, Activision has tried to systematically determine what it is that makes games commercially successful. Cinematic set pieces and pseudo-interactive button prompts are two such examples. Not to be confused with QuickTime events, these are moments where the game pauses and lingers, waiting for you to press the interact button. A shallow effort to imitate cinema while maintaining quote-unquote immersion. Immersion that's immediately broken by the button prompt. Like an actor missing their cue or forgetting their line, the player is left standing still expecting the scene to keep going, only to be informed that it is their turn to press a button. This gives such cinematic sequences an awkward, stop-and-go nature that Sparta kicks the player right out of the game. Or you could be like me and just see how long the game will remain frozen, awaiting you to press a button.
Maybe so. You realize you don't have a choice in this. My patience is not without limits.
I appreciate High Moon throwing jokes in there, many of which could be aimed as much at the player as they are at the character in question. However, any tone or tension being set up beforehand is immediately disrupted. Any excitement deflates as the game seems to laugh at itself.
You would have made partner next week.
Oh yeah, we're not a serious narrative medium, the game seems to say. We're just a video game. This isn't really a critique of the game itself so much as a critique of the era in which these design elements were popular. While the button prompts and QuickTime events have become less common or better executed over time, you know what, never mind. Transformers Fall of Cybertron is also filled with more scripted action sequences, ones that leave the player entirely in control or only wrested away for a brief amount of time. While the illusion of the scripted sequence is never as powerful or exhilarating as second time, and may be too obvious to even compare to the memorability of an emergent gameplay experience, it still delivers the intended emotions within that moment without the player losing control. Optimus being saved by Metroplex early in the game is a good example, as is allowing the player to control Jazz's escape from crumbling, exploding ruins. Of course, I also have a weakness and bias for these sorts of scenes. A lot of other critics would decry these moments as not being suitably challenging or, in the case of Jazz's escape, a bit follow the bouncing command prompt. Executed well, however, these moments are what make games more exciting than film, because rather than watching heroes you know will survive go through a war-torn wasteland, you're the hero yourself, and survival is relying upon your own abilities. It just doesn't always work out that way. It is very easy to assume Transformers Fall of Cybertron is just another assembly line action game designed to be consumed like fast food. Grab it out your car window, shovel it down on the drive home, and dispose of the container as you pass through your kitchen. But these problems of the era in which the game was made are not the summation of Fall of Cybertron. While it may seem High Moon Studios is merely imitating their competition, they were actually learning from them. It's because of all those tropes and conventions that I couldn't figure out why Fall of Cybertron clicked with me. It's a two-weapon shooter, so is it like Halo? Not really, it's too straightforward. It's third person with lots of obvious cover, so is it like Gears of War? Not really, it's too fast-paced. Oh, well if it's fast-paced, perhaps it's like Doom. But that doesn't fit right either. And that's because it is simultaneously taking traits of all those games while being none of them. The term Gears of Doom largely came to my mind as the game is both aggressive and snappy, while also focusing on tactical battlefields or situations. Fall of Cybertron still wants to be a battlefield, but it wants to imitate the same intense action as the old cartoons. War is interpreted through an 80s or 90s gameplay attitude. Let's start with some of the obvious. Many of your opponents will be ducking and dodging behind cover, taking pot shots at you with your generic video game brand assault rifle. Every so often, the combat is broken up with a vehicle section or the opportunity to hop behind a high-powered turret. You can only carry two types of gun at a time. Large, hulking foes charge forward, exposing the weak point in their back. Everything seems to be screaming Halo ripoff. And you know what? That's not entirely inaccurate. Just as every one of Halo's enemies behaves differently based on their species, each opposing robot's tactics are influenced by the weapon they're carrying. The majority of foes are just standard full auto wielding fodder, ducking in and out of cover like a Gears of War game. Shotgunners, however, will force you out of cover by charging in, typically in pairs, and causing some serious harm once firing point blank. These soldiers are essentially responsible for flushing the player out, keeping you on your toes rather than keeping behind cover. Sniper units are similarly always moving, striking from any surface on the map. Rocket units are always located high, giving them a perfect vantage point to mortar you behind any waist-high wall. These three units become more and more common, and thus the player is forced to keep moving and engage in a manner akin to Doom, rather than stop-and-pop Gears of War gameplay. The ease in which enemies fall also contributes to the faster-paced nature of combat. Even without upgraded guns, it doesn't take much to defeat a single enemy. This keeps the player moving from combat arena to combat arena, only occasionally sending in huge numbers that must be torn and sawn through like a serious Sam game. It's a combination that many in the games industry treat as being diametrically opposed. You're either a slower, more tactical shooter, or you're a balls-to-the-wall heavy metal tribute game where it's all about the insane adrenaline rush. But Transformers Fall of Cybertron takes a lot of those new elements and makes them feel old school like Duke Nukem Forever dreams it could have done. As I said, Transformers Fall of Cybertron isn't really innovative, but it knows what made a lot of its competition work well. It may imitate a lot of other titles, but it knows how to leverage them together into an experience that feels familiar, but is indistinguishable. Any shooter runs the risk of becoming worn out by either lasting too long or being unable to vary mechanics up a bit. Transformers Fall of Cybertron takes advantage of its property to make each chapter somewhat distinct. The third major story mission, where players control Decepticons for the first time, is a perfect example of drawing upon the source material to create a more dynamic gameplay experience. Remain in vehicle mode while bombing enemies from above or firing upon the Autobot tanker's wheels, and then shift to robot for on-the-ground cleanup or maneuvering over incoming obstacles. This is replicated later with Starscream, who can transition between a jet fighter for aerial assault to silently infiltrating as a cloaked foot soldier. Transformers Fall of Cybertron is able to leverage the robotic nature of its characters in ways other shooters can't, all because the transition from robot to vehicle is instantaneous and available to the player whenever they so desire. But High Moon didn't just limit themselves to vehicular play. Soundwave is able to send out Laserbeak and Rumble as battlefield compatriots, invincible comrades that can distract and destroy enemy forces. It's a bit irritating that they only fight for a limited period of time and have no cooldown. Okay, I gotta digress and gripe a bit. Once Laserbeak and Rumble return to Soundwave, you can immediately call them out again without cooldown. The only reason to limit the length of time Laserbeak and Rumble are roaming and fighting is if you want to limit how long the player can take advantage of their added strength. But without any sort of cooldown or charge meter, there's nothing to stop the player from sending them right back out. It's a temporary inconvenience that breaks up the combat every few minutes, and therefore disrupts the pacing. They could have instead used a system similar to Grimlock's own transformation. Grimlock is the character you control in the penultimate level, and man, do they make him feel like the proper powerhouse a robotic Tyrannosaurus should be. Not much in the way of ranged capabilities, unless you enjoy picking up enemy Decepticons and throwing them at each other, which I do, like, a lot. Once Grimlock has defeated enough opponents, he can transform into his stomping, fire-breathing dinosaur form. The greatest advantage, of course, being the metal-munching finisher. Like Soundwave's companion cassette tapes, it can only be activated for a limited amount of time. However, you can only make the transformation once you've slain enough foes to fill a meter. So unlike Soundwave, the player must consider when they're going to make the transformation, a sort of risk-reward. Just about every character has their own unique ability. Cliffjumper's car mode enables him to squeeze into tight corridors, making it easier to sneak around Decepticon patrols without being seen. Jazz has a grappling hook that allowed High Moon to craft some creative platforming sections, such as the aforementioned escape sequence. And, of course, to match the X button to open up doors. Again, product of the times. The shooting mechanics are just the baseline experience of Transformers Fall of Cybertron. Each chapter, and therefore character, has its very own unique mechanics that differentiate each level's experience, surpassing the Gears of Doom moniker that so suitably fits Optimus Prime's chapter, but few others after. By bouncing between the different characters, Fall of Cybertron constantly shifts and changes. It transforms, if you will. Eh? Well, either way, where most licensed games are unable to be more than a barely functional grasp of a genre duct taped to a property, High Moon Studios managed to use its cast to craft a varied and exciting, albeit short, game, which finally leads me to... Most final levels in games are pretty terrible. Usually they're just the hardest stage concluding in a boss that eats more bullets than a miniature black hole inside a munitions factory. Instead of being exhilarating, it can be exhausting or even frustrating. The end credits leave the player with an unsatisfied, that's it, feeling. High Moon Studios leverages their property incredibly well one last time by focusing less on a challenging final level and instead on its ensemble cast. Start off the battle as Soundwave assaulting the Autobot Ark in your basic Gears of Doom combat arena. Switch over to Jetfire in what is admittedly the weakest part of the game, just hunting down them weak points. But once that's over, Bruticus swooshes by, and now you're slicing, dicing, stomping, and romping in the big megaton boots of Bruticus. Tap dance on into Jazz's shoes one final time in order to take down the monster you just wrecked house with. A boss fight that focuses on evasion and one last implementation of the grappling hook. These snapshots through the battlefield culminate in one last climactic duel between Optimus Prime and Megatron, and you get to choose which character to fight as. Not only does this final level understand Transformers, it understands video games, which might sound a bit silly to say, as you'd think most game developers would understand their medium. But High Moon managed to latch onto its property as inspiration to craft a truly satisfying climax. While not every character or gameplay element is revisited, jumping between the different styles and sides adds an emotional weight of finality. Each side is desperate, and you manage to feel it from each character. While Jetfire's segment would have been better left as attacking Decepticon guns or some other objective, you get to experience flight one last time before a return of Bruticus' stomping empowerment and Jazz's grappling hook. Hell, the fight between Jazz and Bruticus pulls together shooting mechanics, the grappling hook, vehicular gameplay, and missile strikes into one brief boss battle. It is a highlight not just of the final level, but of the entire game by fusing together so much of what you've learned into a uniquely designed encounter rather than just repeating a prior fight. Bruticus could have easily been a Reaper, but with more hit points. But instead, he's a uniquely designed encounter intended to capitalize on the Decepticon's character and the Autobot mechanics. Rather than asking the player to dedicate hours to one last dungeon, it's maybe half an hour tops to complete this final climactic battle. Nothing in the game lasts too long. It only goes on as long as it needs to. Once Optimus or Megatron stand victorious, the game ends. We've hit our conclusion. After beating Fall of Cybertron, I'm always left hungering for more. But not because I feel dissatisfied with the experience. It's always because I had such a great time I want to go back and do it all again, which is how a final level should make you feel in a video game. It's pretty clear High Moon Studios has a love of the Transformers property. While they toss in the gratuitous homage, both good,
Who disrupts my coronation?
Coronation, Starscream? This is bad comedy.
Who dares to disrupt my coronation?
Coronation, Starscream. This is bad comedy.
Ugh, and bad.
Me, Grimlock, say you full of cesium salami.
Beryllium baloney!
You cut through those guys like beryllium baloney. You mean cesium salami? No, beryllium baloney. Cesium salami.
There's also a deeper understanding of how these characters work. Shockwave is as much the sadistic and intelligent villain you'd hope him to be. You get new background to Grimlock that frames him as being in conflict against Optimus Prime, a potential Autobot variant of Starscream were he not lobotomized by Shockwave. Perhaps my favorite small moment is how Laserbeak will interact with Soundwave, snuggling with his recognized master as opposed to Megatron. But while these things certainly add to Transformers Fall of Cybertron, they aren't what make it a great game. They just make it a better game. Well, for old school Transformers fans, like me. But even if you're not a fan of Transformers, the varied mechanics and capabilities give Fall of Cybertron a vitality that few other licensed properties can even hope to compare to. This isn't merely a good licensed game, it's a good game. Unfortunately, it's an easily forgotten game, in terms of the cultural zeitgeist at least. Activision doesn't really care too much about their old library unless it's Call of Duty, and they are regularly removing titles from digital stores. That it's a licensed game already means players will ignore it if they care less for the property, or will assume it's a lesser game, period. In addition, because there's no specific innovative mechanic, or attempt to appease genre conventions, it's going to be disregarded as just another shooter. But Transformers Fall of Cybertron is so much better than that, and it deserves a better place in player memory. It's a lot of fun, and if you ever get a chance to give it a try, I hope you seize the opportunity faster than Starscream seizes the Energon Knight to stab into Megatron's back.